The wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying with it a chill that didn't belong to any ordinary night. It was the kind of night that made your skin crawl, that made every shadow feel alive, every rustle of leaves a sinister warning. Deep in the woods, where sunlight never fully reached the forest floor, the cabins stood as decaying relics of forgotten lives. Small wooden structures that seemed almost swallowed by the wilderness around them. Some were abandoned, their windows dark and broken, doors creaking with the weight of time. Others were occupied, though the few who dared to stay there often did not return the same, if at all. Tonight, we'll explore 10 true stories that took place in cabins just like these. Stories where ordinary people ventured into the heart of the forest seeking solitude, adventure, or an escape from the world, only to encounter something they could never explain, something that would haunt them forever. And while these tales are terrifying, they also reveal a strange contrast. The woods, which appear peaceful and serene during the day, transform into a labyrinth of nightmares at night, where every sound can hide a threat, and every shadow might be watching. Our first story begins with a young couple, Sarah and Michael, who rented a small cabin miles from the nearest road. It was a perfect weekend getaway, they thought. A chance to disconnect from emails, phones, and the endless buzz of the city. The cabin looked charming in the daylight, rustic with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a porch that overlooked a sparkling stream. But the moment they arrived, Michael felt an unease he couldn't shake. It wasn't anything he could explain. No threatening figure in the distance, no unusual smell, but something about the way the trees seemed to press inward made him feel observed, like the forest itself was alive and silently judging their intrusion. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. Birds had gone to sleep, leaving only the rustle of the wind in the pines. As they settled into bed, a soft thumping began at the edge of the cabin. At first, Sarah laughed it off, assuming it was a branch or perhaps a raccoon. But the thumping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Michael grabbed a flashlight and walked to the door, peering into the blackness beyond the porch. Nothing. Only the faint outlines of trees swaying. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, a trick of the isolation, but he could not ignore the gnawing feeling that someone or something was out there. Then came the whispers, barely audible at first, like the wind speaking in a language they could almost understand. Get out. Go. Leave. Sarah thought she was dreaming, but Michael heard them too. They weren't coming from inside their minds. They were coming from outside, floating through the walls of the cabin. They didn't sound human. Not exactly. There was a guttural resonance, a strange rhythm that seemed to anticipate their fear. In a panic, they turned on every light, shouted into the darkness, But the voices only grew louder, more insistent. By dawn, neither slept, and their idyllic retreat had transformed into a living nightmare. Contrast is powerful in horror, and nowhere is it more evident than in the second story, where an experienced hiker named Tom ventured alone into the woods for a weekend of reflection. He prided himself on being unshakable, someone who thrived in isolation. The cabin he found was older than most, with moss growing thick across the roof and windows clouded with decades of grime. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and a faint metallic tang, like rust. Tom set up his gear, lit the fireplace, and settled into a routine that would have been comforting in any other environment. But the night revealed the forest's darker personality. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Tom awoke to the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. He froze, heart pounding, flashlight in hand, convinced that some local prankster or a lost hiker had wandered near. But when he opened the door, the porch was empty. Then came the scratching, sharp, desperate, as if something was clawing at the cabin's foundation. Tom's logical mind searched for explanations. A raccoon, a deer, a fallen branch. But the intensity and precision of the sounds made him reconsider. Or something knew he was there. Over the next hour, the scratching shifted around the cabin, moving from the roof to the walls, circling him, creating the sensation of being trapped in a predator's gaze. By morning, Tom had packed his belongings and left, vowing never to return. The third story introduces us to a group of friends seeking adventure. 4 of them, eager for a break from city life, discovered a secluded cabin while exploring a less traveled trail. At first, it was perfect, adventurous, exhilarating, a chance to prove themselves in nature. But the forest has its own agenda. On the first night, a strange figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, glimpsed only through the flickering shadows cast by the fire. When they approached, it vanished, leaving behind only footprints that were too large, too elongated to belong to a human. Panic and curiosity collided. They argued over whether to stay, whether they were imagining things. But ultimately, the fear became overwhelming, especially when one of the friends, Jake, reported feeling unseen hands brush against his shoulder while he slept. Contrast between expectation and reality, between safety and danger, is what drives fear. In each of these stories, the cabin seems harmless, a promise of comfort, yet it becomes a trap, a stage for terror. The fourth story takes this even further. A writer named Ellen sought solitude to finish her novel, moving into a small lakeside cabin that appeared on a rental website with glowing reviews. The first day was idyllic, with sunlight bouncing off the water and birds singing in the trees. But by nightfall, the cabin transformed. Footsteps echoed upstairs. Though she was alone, doors that she swore were locked were ajar in the morning. A mirror reflected not her own image, but a shadowy figure standing just behind her. The contrast between the serene daylight and the terror of night was stark. And Ellen quickly realized that some truths of the forest could not be reasoned away with logic. By the fifth story, we begin to see a pattern. The woods themselves become a character, a silent, patient observer that reveals its menace slowly, deliberately. In this account, a man named Victor sought to reconnect with his estranged brother, renting a cabin far from cell service to encourage bonding. The first day was pleasant, full of conversation, hiking, and cooking over the fire. But that night, a low humming filled the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards. Victor followed it outside, expecting to see machinery, perhaps another nearby cabin, but there was nothing. When he returned inside, he found a note, written in a shaky hand on the kitchen counter. "You shouldn't have come." And this is where the power of contrast truly emerges. The difference between daylight, when the world seems ordered and familiar, and the night, when isolation and fear bend reality into unrecognizable shapes. The next stories continue this rhythm. Each cabin presents normalcy and warmth during the day, only to invert these comforts as night falls, revealing horrors that defy logic. These first 5 stories share a common thread: the sense of being watched, of trespassing into a domain that does not belong to humans. The cabins, while seemingly safe, act as conduits for forces beyond comprehension. And each protagonist learns the same lesson. Curiosity can be deadly when confronted with the unknown. And yet, there is a strange allure to these tales, an irresistible pull for those who dare to imagine themselves in the woods at night, hearing whispers just beyond the door, footsteps circling unseen, and shadows that move with a mind of their own. The forest is patient, and it waits. Each cabin is a silent witness to the horrors that unfold, and those who enter are marked by what they experience. By the time our first section ends, the contrast between the bright, inviting exterior and the menacing darkness inside has been firmly established, setting the stage for deeper, darker, and more disturbing encounters in the stories to come. The sixth story begins with a man named Greg, a photographer who specialized in capturing the untouched wilderness. He had spent months planning a solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the mountains, hoping to photograph wildlife and escape the constant barrage of city noise. The cabin appeared charming on the map, a rustic moss-covered structure with a small stream running nearby. But upon arrival, the tranquility felt almost too perfect, unnaturally so. Even the birds seemed subdued, their calls muffled by the dense canopy overhead. The first evening, Greg set up his camera gear and ventured to photograph the sunset filtering through the pines. As twilight fell, the forest transformed, the golden glow of day giving way to an inky darkness that seemed to press against him from all sides. Returning to the cabin, he noticed footprints in the snow outside the front door. Large, uneven, and impossible to identify. They weren't his, nor did they match any animals he knew. Dismissing it as a trick of the fading light, he shrugged it off, assuming some local hiker had passed by. But as night deepened, strange noises began. Scratches on the walls, faint whispers, and the sound of something pacing just beyond the window made him question his decision to come alone. Greg tried to sleep, telling himself it was his imagination. But in the middle of the night, he awoke to the sound of a slow, deliberate knock on the cabin door. He froze. The knock repeated, steady and insistent, echoing through the small wooden structure. Summoning courage, he opened the door. But no one was there. Only the empty darkness of the forest stared back at him. That night, he swore he saw shapes moving among the trees. Tall, gaunt figures that paused when he looked directly at them, vanishing as soon as he blinked. By dawn, he had packed his cameras and left. Yet even months later, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Contrast is at the heart of horror. And the seventh story is a perfect example. A couple, Emma and Liam, sought a quiet weekend getaway in a lakeside cabin they found online. It looked idyllic. A small dock, a fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that gave the illusion of floating above the water. During the day, the world seemed tranquil. The lake mirrored the sky, birds flitted about, and the air was crisp and clean. But night brought an entirely different reality. On the first night, they heard the faintest of whispers, like voices carried across the lake by the wind. At first, it sounded like nothing more than their imagination. But then, they noticed shadows moving along the tree line. Shapes that didn't belong to any animal they knew. Liam, trying to be rational, suggested it was deer or raccoons. But Emma wasn't convinced. She had the feeling of being watched. A creeping sensation that someone or something was studying them from the forest. The tension escalated when she noticed small handprints in the condensation on the windows, as though tiny, pale hands had pressed against the glass to look inside. By the third night, the couple's nerves were frayed. The whispers became more coherent, forming fragmented words. Go. Leave. You're not safe. They tried to leave, only to find the car wouldn't start. Panic set in as they realized the forest had a way of isolating them, cutting them off from escape. Hours passed in agonizing terror, each rustle and snap amplified in the silence. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the trees, the voices ceased. Emma and Liam left the cabin behind, never to return, haunted by the thought that something or someone had been deliberately keeping them trapped. Our eighth story introduces a man named Simon, who rented a cabin to reconnect with his teenage son, who had grown distant after a difficult year. The cabin was deep in the forest, far from neighbors or cell service. Simon hoped the solitude would help them bond, but instead, the isolation became a test of their sanity. On the first night, Simon awoke to the sound of his son whispering in the darkness, though the boy was asleep in his bed. Shadows danced across the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Over the next 2 nights, things escalated. The cabin itself seemed to react to their presence. Doors would slam shut without wind, objects moved inexplicably, and cold spots appeared in certain rooms, lingering like unseen fingers tracing their skin. Simon attempted to rationalize the events, blaming fatigue and imagination, but his son's growing terror convinced him something was genuinely wrong. On the final night, they heard scratching at the bedroom door, followed by low growls that reverberated through the floorboards. Terrified, Simon grabbed his son and fled into the forest, never looking back, leaving behind a cabin that seemed to breathe with malevolence. The ninth story takes us even deeper into the uncanny. A young woman named Claire, an artist, sought solitude to work on her painting. She rented a cabin tucked away along a narrow trail, surrounded by thick pines. On the first day, everything was idyllic. Sunlight streaming through the windows, a gentle breeze rustling leaves, and a serene silence that encouraged creativity. But as dusk fell, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. She heard faint tapping on the roof, then a rhythmic thudding that echoed through the walls. At first, she assumed it was animals or weather, but the sounds were too deliberate, too precise. That night, she awoke to a figure standing at the foot of her bed, barely discernible in the dim moonlight. Panic paralyzed her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stared with an intensity that made her skin crawl. By morning, the figure had vanished, leaving only a cold draft and the lingering scent of decay. Claire packed her things and left immediately, forever changed by the brush with something that defied explanation. Contrast remains a critical tool in these stories. The difference between daytime serenity and nighttime terror, between perceived safety and hidden danger, keeps the mind unsettled. In all these accounts, the cabins themselves act as catalysts, amplifying fear through isolation and confinement. The 10th story we'll cover in this section exemplifies this principle perfectly. A group of college friends, 4 in total, decided to rent a cabin for a weekend of hiking and relaxation. The cabin was quaint and welcoming during the day, with warm sunlight streaming through the windows, a small fireplace, and wooden floors that creaked gently underfoot. But the woods around it held a darker rhythm. On the first night, they heard laughter in the distance, faint and distorted, like echoes of a previous time. When they investigated, they found nothing. Just the empty forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. By the second night, the laughter transformed into whispers, calling their names in voices they didn't recognize. Shadows appeared in corners where none should have existed, and doors that were locked became ajar, seemingly on their own. Each friend experienced a different manifestation of fear. Visions of figures lurking just out of sight, objects moving without cause, and a pervasive sense of being watched. By the final morning, they left the cabin shaken, each carrying a memory that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. As the section closes, we see a pattern emerge. The cabins themselves may be simple wooden structures, but the forest transforms them into instruments of terror. Isolation, darkness, and the unknown converge, creating scenarios where the mind cannot easily distinguish between imagination and reality. Every story underscores the terrifying contrast between daylight and night, comfort and danger, normalcy and the uncanny. The 11th story begins with a man named Marcus, a history professor who rented a cabin in a remote forest to write a book on old folklore. The cabin was reportedly built over a century ago and had a reputation for being haunted among locals. Though Marcus dismissed the warnings as superstition. The first evening, he explored the property, noticing carved symbols etched into the door frames and beams, symbols he didn't recognize. They were intricate, looping shapes that seemed to follow no known pattern. Yet they gave off a palpable sense of warning, as if etched to ward off, or perhaps contain, something. At night, the cabin's atmosphere changed drastically. The wind outside howled through the trees in unnatural patterns, sounding almost like voices whispering in a language Marcus couldn't understand. Floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps, and the shadows cast by the fireplace flickered oddly, forming shapes that seemed to move independently of the flames. Marcus tried to convince himself it was his imagination, but when he looked in the mirror, he noticed reflections that didn't match his movements perfectly. A shadow lingered behind him, vanishing whenever he turned. On the second night, things escalated further. Marcus awoke to a scratching sound at the window, sharp and insistent, like claws dragging across the glass. He drew back the curtain, expecting to see an animal, but the window reflected nothing except for the dim outline of a figure inside the room. Panicked, he reached for the nearest object, a candlestick, but the figure had disappeared. Marcus spent the night in the corner of the cabin, clutching the candlestick, listening to the sound of someone or something pacing just outside the door. The 12th story introduces a young couple, Ryan and Sophie, who rented a cabin for their anniversary. They had heard local legends about strange occurrences in the woods but laughed them off, thinking it would make for a fun story later. During the day, the cabin was serene, sunlight spilling through the trees, birds singing, and the gentle rustle of leaves creating a soothing soundtrack. But as night fell, the calm turned sinister. It began with subtle signs, objects slightly moved from where they had been left, strange footprints in the dust, and fleeting shadows glimpsed out of the corner of their eyes. The real terror began when they heard voices whispering just beyond the walls, calling their names with perfect clarity. Ryan tried to rationalize the experience, claiming it was the wind or his imagination. But Sophie felt the presence of something malignant, something that didn't belong in the natural world. The whispers eventually escalated to cries, as if unseen creatures were pleading for release or warning them to leave. By the third night, Ryan and Sophie had abandoned their plans for romance, instead fleeing the cabin with hearts pounding and minds racing, leaving behind a place that seemed alive with its own dark consciousness. Contrast is crucial in horror, and the 13th story highlights this beautifully. A single mother, Helen, rented a cabin to escape the city and give her son Jake a week in nature. The cabin seemed harmless during the day, bathed in sunlight, birdsong, and the laughter of Jake as he explored. But at night, Helen noticed subtle shifts, doors closing when no wind blew, the faint smell of smoke even though the fireplace hadn't been lit, and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. One evening, Helen awoke to find Jake's bed empty. She panicked, searching the cabin and surrounding forest, only to find him asleep in a corner of the living room, muttering words that made no sense. He claimed that someone or something had whispered secrets to him, urging him to follow. Helen dismissed it as a dream, but the next night, she awoke to find him staring out the window at the dark woods, speaking in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. Terrified, she left the cabin immediately, convinced that whatever had touched her son's mind wasn't human, and that the forest had a consciousness that preyed on the vulnerable. The 14th story involves a writer named Tobias, who sought a remote cabin to finish his novel. The cabin was small, tucked deep in the woods, with a single dirt path leading to it. On his first night, he noticed faint tapping on the walls, almost like a rhythm trying to communicate. Assuming it was the wind or an animal, he ignored it. But the next evening, the tapping formed a pattern, as if someone or something was attempting to write with Morse code on the wooden walls. Tobias tried to decode it, but the symbols made no sense. By the third night, the cabin seemed to shift around him. Hallways appeared that hadn't existed before, and doors led to rooms he had never seen. Tobias became disoriented, unable to distinguish between reality and hallucination. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by whispers in a language that clawed at his comprehension. Finally, he fled the cabin, leaving behind his belongings, including the manuscript, which locals later claimed was never found, except for faint scratches on the door that spelled out something no one could read. Contrast between day and night, safety and danger, reality and hallucination recurs as a theme in all these accounts. The 15th story emphasizes this by following a group of hikers who stumbled upon a seemingly abandoned cabin while lost in the forest. The cabin looked inviting, with sunlight glinting off its windows and a smoke-free chimney suggesting recent occupancy. They decided to spend the night, feeling comforted by the structure's solidity. However, nightfall turned the place sinister. Whispers echoed through the forest, calling the hikers' names with an unnatural familiarity. Shadows moved independently of light sources. Doors creaked open by themselves, and the cabin seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting subtly. One hiker vanished in the middle of the night, leaving only footprints that led nowhere. By dawn, the survivors fled, leaving the cabin intact, yet forever haunted by the memory of a place that seemed both welcoming and malevolent, its dual nature amplifying their terror. The 16th story centers on a man named Alex, who sought a cabin for solitude and meditation. The cabin was deep in the forest, isolated and surrounded by dense undergrowth. During the day, Alex found peace, noting the harmony between the forest and his spirit. But night brought unease. Objects shifted position without explanation. Cold drafts passed through closed doors, and faint whispers floated from the shadows. The most unsettling occurrence happened on the third night when Alex awoke to a figure standing over his bed. It was tall, dark, and formless, yet its presence radiated intent. Watching, waiting, paralyzed with fear, he could only lie still as the figure dissipated with the first light of dawn. Alex left the cabin immediately, convinced that the forest itself was alive, and that the cabin had been a vessel for something ancient and watchful, something that thrived on solitude and fear. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Cabins in deep woods are never merely structures. They act as amplifiers for fear. Isolation, darkness, and the uncensored become characters in their own right, shaping events that test the boundaries of sanity and courage. Each story relies on contrast, the serene day giving way to the horrors of night, the comforting structure revealing itself as a trap, the mind wrestling with the uncertainty of perception versus reality. The 17th story revolves around an elderly man named Harold, who had long been fascinated by the legends of the woods near his hometown. He rented a small, neglected cabin that locals avoided, claiming it was cursed. Harold, a skeptic at heart, considered it a perfect opportunity to prove that fear was only a product of imagination. The first night was uneventful, with only the usual creaks of an old wooden structure and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. But as the darkness deepened, subtle disturbances began. Shadows that stretched too far, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls, and the soft scrape of nails on the floorboards. Harold dismissed these as tricks of the mind. Yet, the air in the cabin began to feel heavy, almost viscous, as if the darkness itself were pressing against him. At midnight, he heard a voice clearly calling his name, slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls. Hesitant, he followed the sound to a small closet, expecting perhaps a stray animal. Instead, he found nothing, yet the whisper persisted, now mingled with a faint smell of smoke and decay. It was as if the cabin remembered the lives that had passed through it, and it hungered for new stories to consume. The 18th story introduces twins, Ella and Liam, who were adventurous and somewhat reckless. They booked a remote cabin for a weekend escape, ignoring warnings about the area. The day was idyllic, bright sunlight, fresh air, and the laughter of two young people enjoying freedom. But by dusk, the mood shifted. The forest outside became suffocatingly quiet. The trees seeming to bend and twist toward the cabin as if observing their every move. That night, the twins were awakened by scratching sounds coming from the walls, escalating into rhythmic banging. Panicked, they tried to leave, but the path out of the woods had vanished, replaced by endless trees and shadows that disoriented them. The cabin seemed to expand internally, rooms appearing where none had existed, hallways stretching impossibly long. Their fear intensified when they discovered their reflections in the windows no longer mirrored their movements correctly. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It had become an entity with intent, manipulating reality to trap and terrify them. By dawn, the twins managed to stumble onto a real path. But the memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder of how quickly safety can turn into peril. The 19th story follows a young artist named Miriam, seeking inspiration in isolation. She rented a cabin deep within the forest, believing that solitude and nature would spark her creativity. At first, it did. The sunlight filtered through the trees in brilliant patterns, and she painted for hours, losing herself in color and brushstrokes. But as night fell, Miriam noticed shadows that didn't belong, twisting in unnatural ways on the walls. Her own artwork began to change overnight, images appearing that she had never painted, depicting figures in torment or places she had never seen. By the third night, whispers filled the cabin, coaxing her to paint things she feared but could not name. Miriam realized too late that the cabin was feeding off her creativity and emotions, twisting them into manifestations of terror. She fled at first light, leaving behind canvases that locals later reported to be haunted, depicting scenes that shifted when viewed at different angles, as if the cabin's darkness had imprinted itself onto them. The 20th and final story involves a hiker named Daniel, who stumbled upon a cabin while lost during a storm. The structure appeared abandoned, yet the warmth of a fire inside suggested recent activity. Relieved, he entered only to find the cabin eerily furnished with personal items, clothes, books, and photographs, but none belonging to him or anyone he knew. Nightfall brought a storm outside, but inside, the cabin seemed alive, with objects moving subtly, chairs shifting, and faint whispers murmuring in the corners. Daniel attempted to sleep, but was awakened by the sensation of being watched. A figure appeared in the doorway, vague and dark, its shape impossible to define. It remained motionless, yet its presence radiated an intent that Daniel could feel pressing on his mind. He fled the cabin at dawn, convinced that it was not just a building, but a living repository of all who had entered, shaping the forest around it into a labyrinth of fear. By the end of these 20 tales, one truth becomes clear. Cabins in the deep woods are more than isolated shelters. They are catalysts for fear, amplifiers of the human mind's vulnerabilities, and vessels for unknown entities that manipulate perception, reality, and emotion. Each story demonstrates the delicate balance between safety and terror, the contrast of light and darkness, day and night, reason and madness. The cabins may seem inviting, nestled in serene landscapes, yet they conceal layers of malevolence that prey upon isolation, curiosity, and vulnerability. Whether it is the scratching at the windows, whispers in unknown languages, shifting shadows, or impossible architecture, the pattern is undeniable. These cabins are alive in their own sinister way, feeding off fear, curiosity, and imagination. They stand as monuments to the unknown, where reality bends and the forest itself becomes complicit. Anyone who dares to enter must confront not only the darkness outside, but the darkness within themselves, realizing that sometimes the scariest place is the one where you least expect it. Your own mind mirrored in the silent, watchful walls of a cabin in the deep woods.